we're gonna continue what we started a little more than a month ago, and I know that a lot of school has happened since then. So we're gonna do a little bit of review, but if you can remember from last time that we visited together, we said that one of the goals over the course this year is to, you've got these F's. Increasingly, I'm becoming more of a fan of alliteration. I'm a Southerner, and I probably listen to more than my fair share of your traditional Southern Baptist sermons. So you got to have your alliteration. You got your points that you use over and over and over again that start with the same letter. But one of the things that we talked about is it's important to have a strong foundation. Obviously, we at Covenant have a lot of gifts that other schools don't. One of those being that Covenant has a disproportionately low staff turnover. The average private school, I don't know if you'll know this, the average private school in our country, the average turnover is 11% of faculty per year. So you think about it, if you have 30 some odd teachers, well, you're replacing 3 or so, a little more than that every single year. If you think about that, over 5 years, you've changed a lot of your faculty out. Because y'all have not had a lot of turnover, that allows you as a school to kind of not have to keep going back to make sure that everyone's on the same page, that you kind of start saying, well, we've got sort of a foundation. How do we then take that foundation and develop more fluency in terms of common language? And we'll talk some about that today. But once again, the goal is to build on that foundation where you say, we've got these core things that we hold and believe to be true. How then does that become sort of the vernacular of the school so that then our kids can flourish? Because, and I used this example before, if you're in a school context where one teacher says the image of God means this, and another teacher says the image of God means this, and another teacher says this, that creates confusion for the littles. That we want to all be on the same page. That fluency gives us the ability to help our students flourish because they need that clarity. And so I share with you all here some more alliteration, 5 C's, that part of is what we're trying to develop here. By developing a common vocabulary, that gives us the clarity as a school, because especially think about like admissions tours. Someone comes for an admissions tour and they're walking around, and the same things they hear from John as he's doing one, or Sarah or whoever else, is also being said by the teachers, that we're using the same sort of language. You have to have that common vocabulary to have that clarity. Clarity then gives you coherence, and coherence is this idea that things begin to make sense. They start to stick together. There's then comprehensiveness. You start seeing it throughout. And then we talked about that centripetal patterns, that as we do this, things continually rotate back into a central focus, which would be the person of Jesus. The writer of the book of Hebrews tells us that Jesus is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. And he upholds the universe by the word of his power. That's the writer of Hebrews, as I said, he gives us this idea that Jesus is the central focus of all of history, of all of creation, and he upholds it. So that's part of the goal. Something else that I want to make sure that's always in front of us, that in one way or another, the task of Christian education is a task of spiritual formation. I've got the privilege increasingly of thinking a lot about spiritual formation. I'm on a team of other coaches for the Herzog Foundation that's exploring and teaching and developing spiritual formation curriculum for the Herzog Foundation. And this idea of spiritual formation is this big question of, well, how are people formed as people of faith? And how is Christian education at the tip of the spear for accomplishing that in the lives of our kids? And one of the things that we keep saying over and over and over again is that y'all are discipling kids. That's actually what's happening. It just so happens that education is the vehicle by which you're doing that. That fundamentally, that's the goal. The goal is discipleship. The goal is formation. The goal is, because that's where the lasting change happens. And we talk about formation. I love kind of this, and you've probably heard conversations about head, hand, heart, or heart, soul, mind. But I like to use it in terms of these words of upward, inward, and outward in terms of how we are formed. That there's constantly this upward formation that's happening, that we are being formed to know God more, to understand who He is. And actually, the more that we understand who He is through our studies, through our experiences, through our interactions, that begins to also form and shape us inwardly. But we don't want to just stop there. We also want that then to radiate out into an outward formation, that it causes us to care about others. It causes us, we talked some about that last time with the idea of stewardship. That when we talk about upward and inward and outward, that we're constantly trying to say that kids are being shaped, and the reason we want them to love God more is because He's first. But the more they see Him truly as first, and that properly orders their thinking, that gives them a proper understanding of themselves. That we want them to understand themselves so they can understand then how to relate to others, to understand how to relate to the world that's around them. So we introduced these 7 questions last time. Well, actually, we did this multiple years ago, but we continue to go back to them. That all worldviews, certainly a Christian worldview, deals with what do we believe about God? What do we believe about truth? What do we believe about people, behavior? That's kind of like all philosophies, all worldviews. But then certainly there's a Christian understanding of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration, that there's a way all things are supposed to be. There's something that's clearly wrong, and certainly everything is going to be fixed. And that by going back to these same questions over and over and over again, I think that helps us to have a proper upward, inward, and outward approach to the world. So last time we said, well, these questions, I think they help affect our approach, how we look at the world. It certainly affects how we think about our task here at Covenant Christian School. And so last time we talked about stewardship, using these questions to think about stewardship. How does it shape us? How does it help us to see God more? How does it help us to see others more? This week, well, this month, I said that we are going to start talking about our specials: art and music, outdoor classroom, PE, our library. Now, the outdoor classroom, I'm going to talk minimally, and I would like to focus minimally on the outdoor classroom, not as though it plays a minor role. It's a very prominent role in the life of our school. And the experiential learning and all of the components with that, because we're going to tackle one entire month is going to be focused on all of those pieces together: the outdoor classroom, experiential learning, this notion that we're an outdoorsy school. But that certainly is one of our specials, but I want to think specifically about these other specials. And I want to pause even for a second here and make sure that we constantly go back to the notion that this also is not just consistent with the philosophy of this school, this is consistent with the philosophy of this church. We are a ministry of a church, which there's a lot of benefit to that. Sometimes we don't talk about that, but that is a prominent, this is the largest ministry of a Presbyterian church. And this church has a view, a well-developed world and life view, to see all things under the preeminence of Jesus. You say, well, don't all Christians think that way? Well, you think about historically, there have been a lot of Christians that drew a pretty strong line between those things which are good, those things which are bad, and those things which are neutral. Well, one of the things that comes out of our church, you could even say a Reformed tradition, is this notion that all of life, you remove that which is contrary to the character of God, and all of life should be seen under the preeminence of Jesus and celebrated. It's a full view of all things. And because that's become so much kind of the culture of our school, sometimes we don't even think that that's actually, it kind of flows out of a theology that is consistent with a church, not just our church, many of our churches here in town. But we're going to look at our specials. They are not lesser. They are just as much a part of who we are as a school. We have these letters, BRE. It's also part of our vernacular. What does the B stand for? Okay. Yeah, y'all know these things. What's the R? Relational. Okay. Integral. And then what's the E? Experiential. Do the specials increase or diminish our capacity to do these things? To be biblical, relational, integral, experiential. Do they increase or do they get in the way? What do y'all think? They increase? For sure, yeah, for sure. They absolutely do. Now, typically when we talk about integral, most of the language that goes around talking about integral, I think probably whenever people say, well, we have an integral, what word comes next? Curriculum. Okay, and when people typically think curriculum, what do people think about in the life of a school when they hear curriculum? Like math. Yes. Yes, your academic disciplines. Okay. But these specials we have up there, they are part of the curriculum of this school. And I think that's an important thing to be even part of that common vernacular, that common vocabulary of the school, that the PE class is part of the curriculum of the school. Y'all probably are familiar. Does every Christian school in the city of St. Louis have 2 recesses? No, no. Okay, so we have multiple recesses most days. Is that part of the curriculum of the school? Yes, that is part of the curriculum. Okay, because what is the curriculum? That's the program, and actually it flows out of this. Is there learning that happens at recess? Yes. Oh yeah, lots of learning. Because learning, once again, we talk about whole child. Learning is not just like an intellectual cognitive thing, it's a whole person thing. And that's just as important, and a lot of that happens. Actually, I have some pelicans in my home that sometimes I hear that they talk about things they learned in class at recess. What nerds. Like that go out to recess and they're still talking about something like, what? Now that doesn't happen every day, obviously, and honestly, we don't want them to. But sometimes it shows up in their conversation because that learning, it's an all of life sort of thing. That's what you want. But integral is not just, oh, we figured out a way to knit together our math and our science and our history, but even thinking about our specials as part of that integral, specials as part of that experiential, specials as part of that relational. So what we're going to do today is we're going to, once again, we're just going to, I want this to be more of a conversation. I think these are things y'all know, but sometimes just by going back to these questions, it helps you to be reminded and to believe these things that much more deeply. So how do our specials, that first question, okay, so Christians believe that God is first. He is first. God is ultimate. And certainly, I mean, you look at some of the cornerstones around this property, we say to the glory of God. Okay, so what we're saying is that God's glory is primary in our school. Okay, so how do our specials, I want y'all to think about this, process this a little bit. How do our specials, and almost with each of these questions, I want you to think in terms of if we didn't have them. So let's say Covenant Christian School was, you came to school, the school day starts, and you're with your kids all day, apart from, your recess and lunch, but there is no going to the specials. How do your specials, now specials teachers as well as classroom teachers can certainly answer this, but how do your specials help our students, help us as a school community to recognize God as ultimate over everything else? How does it increase our capacity? We make this important. And even something Sonia said here, so we've made it important, we've carved out space. On some level, is it inconvenient to have the specials? Some of you are like, I can't wait. You're like, yes, it breaks up her day.
I think it brings other people into our lives.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, yeah.
Other people are speaking about his life. So as a parent, as a teacher, it's like, I'm so glad Mrs. Fields brings her musical genius into our you know, using our bodies kind of thing. So
yeah. Okay, why do other schools, maybe if they have to make cuts, why are the specials the first to go? They're not on a test. Okay.
Probably for kids, sometimes specials like their lifeline.
Mm.
It might not be their thing, but
Yep.
it's the cherry on the fire quote. Like, I feel God's pleasure when I run. I feel God's pleasure when
Yep.
I play sport, when I'm doing music. Like that.
Yes.
It's the forefront of who God created them to be, and sometimes that could be their lifeline.
Yep. Absolutely.
And you go off of that, like the body of Christ in like the church, like we're all gifted in different ways, and how if we weren't gifted in different ways, we wouldn't function.
Yes.
I think that as well is the kids.
Yeah. See the body of Christ in a much broader way. That's a good thing.
I think it helps us recognize too that God has created us each individuals and unique and different from each other. I think it helps just those different talents stand out.
Yep. Those talents come out and the stewarding of those. Are there any other ways that specials help us to recognize God as God? It's not taking away. It's not. I referenced this a little bit a while ago. One of my friends who I get to work with on the spiritual formation piece, he's the head of a school in Minnesota. 4 years ago, he mandated that the entire school, K through 12, cuts a third out of their curriculum. I mean, like you talk about angering a bunch of your teachers. He says you have a year, you have to figure it out. By this time next year, I want you to trim your curriculum by a third. And he's like, 4 years later, our ERB scores are higher, our ACT scores are higher, our SA, by every metric, we've done less instruction and there's more learning that's happened. They increased passing periods between classes, they increased lunchtime, they increased recess times. They're like, we need to figure out, and they added in more specials because they said we need to create space to allow kids to be human rather than frenzied. And he's like, it's so yeah, less instruction, but more learning. Yeah, nothing's taken away by carving that space out. What were you going to say?
Oh, I was just going to say, like, it's more like real world application.
Yeah.
They don't understand why they're doing math or science. They're like, this doesn't relate to my everyday right now. And taking it to the specials too shows them how it relates to their life. And if they care about it, then they're going to care about learning about it.
Ah, yeah. 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 One of the things I think is amazing here is that, those of you that are classroom teachers, you've got your students, and then when they go to a specials, one of the other teachers in any capacity, even like you think the C groups, to hear another teacher also say the same thing within their sphere of influence and to say this too gives God glory. I think that sort of, it just further creates that habit and that rhythm that, oh, wait a second. In music, we can glorify God. In art, we can glorify God. In these other classes, that all of these are ways for us to learn more about who God is. And God is a creator God. G.K. Chesterton, my favorite author, says that art, more than anything else, is the stamp of the divine upon man. More than anything else. Because look at the rest of creation. The rest of creation does not create simply out of the joy to create. We create out of need. I need to build a nest. There is functional. We create simply for the purpose of the joy of creation. I mean, God didn't need to create us. He did it for the joy, like the beautiful notion that in art, to use our voices to praise God, to use our bodies. And obviously you can do some of those things in your classrooms, but to go to another space dedicated to that. So constantly, they need to hear these truths. We're going to music today to worship God. We're going to art today to worship God. We're going to PE today to worship God. And we already alluded to this too. Are there some students in your classroom that may not like going to certain specials? Yes. If Linda's kind of with us. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Why do I have, okay, why? We're going to this place to worship God. So there's a school over in Fenton. I got to be the head of the school, interim for a while. They require every single Heritage Classical Christian Academy, they require every single 10th and 11th grader to take 2 full years of music history. And they have to be in choir, like non-negotiable. Because they're like, if we're studying the history, you have to do the performance. Like, so you have kids like, well, I have to do 2 years of choir? Yes. Why? Even if they don't sing well, because we are creating rhythms to teach you this too is another way in which God's people worship him. Plus, by the way, they've noticed that those kids opt in quite often as seniors to take a 3rd year of music history and choir. It's not just their sophomores and juniors. How do specials help us model and encourage dependence upon God's truth wherever it's seen? How do they help students see truth in a new way? Okay, so once again, all worldviews deal with what do you believe about God? All worldviews deal with truth. What is not, how do we understand truth and knowledge? So Christians believe something about truth. We believe truth comes from God. We believe that truth, we are dependent, not independent for truth. How do our specials help us to see truth in a new way? Linda, have you ever made or required, sorry, not made, required students to sing in a different language? Yeah, just a little bit. Okay. What do kids learn by learning another language? What are some of the things they learn in having to learn another language or bits and pieces of another language? What are some of the things they learn? Ah, they're learning about other people. Other languages. Yes, this world is big. And other people say the exact same things, just in different ways. And that's good. Truth is a lot bigger than just English and America. It's bigger. Kathy, I think a little bit about the library. How does the library help students see truth in fuller and new ways?
Well, they're able to see what other people have written and how they're reflecting God's truth in what's being written. And they're also able to see that they need to seek God's truth and be discerning about what they read.
Teach them a lot about discernment, different people's perspectives. There's an author named Alan Jacobs. He wrote a book called A Theology of Reading. He's a professor at Baylor. And Alan Jacobs says in his book, love thy neighbor is not a statement that only applies to the person sitting across the table from you. It also applies to the author of the book you're reading. It's a fascinating idea, like to read in a way that you're honoring the dignity of the author that you're reading. Like looking for his benefit, looking for his good or her good. And to see this person wrote this book because he or she has something to say. And what can I learn through this thing that this person has to say? This person, through telling his or her story, could help us to see God more fully. Yeah, I think our specials in unique ways can help us to see truth. Eugene Peterson, y'all familiar with Eugene Peterson? Wrote lots of really wonderful books. He has one book entitled Christ Plays in 10,000 Places. And it's just this beautiful book. He writes so lovely. Christ plays in 10,000 places that like you go here and you see Christ in an unexpected place. That through art, through music, through PE, through our outdoor classroom, through our library, our students get to see truth in a brand new way. And sometimes truth is not stuff that just speaks to your head. Sometimes it speaks to your heart. Socrates says that, it's actually interesting. Socrates in the Republic says that we should censor music more than anything else. What? Why not like censor like radical ideas? He says because music penetrates the soul quicker than anything else. And we know that's true. That's why, some pastors, when they get to the high point of their sermon, the mood music starts because they really want to drive it home. Because now you're not just accessing the cognitive part of the person, but the emotive part. So now you're bringing out more of the image bearerness, and now you're hooking them. It's a trick, but it's not a trick that's just random. It works because we're image bearers. We're whole persons. That's why it works. Like all of a sudden you get this, or maybe the dry ice. So now you're starting to feel it. Okay, all of that is starting to work. Okay, it is a carefully thought through plan to access more of your whole person. And all of a sudden that truth starts to seep down even more without you even knowing it. What are the ways that we can take place? Oh, here's some truth here. And then you kind of take them by the hand. Oh, here's some truth over here. And you take them by the hand. Here's some more truth over here. Before they know it, they're like, whoa, it's all over the place. Yes. And specials give us additional capacity to do that. How do specials help us to honor humans as God? And we've already alluded to some of this. Anything else? Because we already talked about this some. How do the specials help us to honor? So human beings, we're created in the image of God. And last time I talked about this, being an image bearer means that we're not just rational beings, we're also relational beings, we're moral beings, we're spiritual beings, we're creative beings. How do the specials help us do this in ways that may not be as easily accessible in our classrooms?
I think they can allow kids to put things in their practice in the library and talk a lot about being quiet. Don't like to be light, and then that's
Yeah. And you have a space where kids are almost, it would be hard, and I'm sure you have to fight this some, but it would be hard not to want to go into that space and want to read. It nurtures a sense of like all this is working together to get us to love reading. How else does the specials help us to access these things?
I think like PE, there's definitely different types of conflicts that arise from sportsmanship, and so just teaching that relational piece and just forgiveness and grace and how we love each other well. So that just brings in a whole different thing that I might see in the classroom. You might not see that in the classroom. Right?
Yeah. What else? How else do the specials help us honor and recognize our students as rational, relational, moral, and spiritual and creative beings?
I think kids can see their classmates' gifts in a different way. So go to art, like, wow, the student artist, they can celebrate that.
Yeah. Yeah, and so we even have the Lego robotics. It's not really a special, like it doesn't carve out space during the school day, but afterwards. There are probably some students that flourish there that would struggle to flourish in other places. And then you think about other schools like like big time robotics classes. And I mean this affectionately, like a computer geek that probably academically is not going to flourish and athletically not going to flourish, but you put them in a class, like some kind of club with other like computery people, and all of a sudden they come alive and they have a space. Because belonging is a big part, like all of us need to belong. So the specials help maybe with some of that. And by the way, like I said, I think a lot of y'all push a lot of these things towards our students anyway. I mean, I hear stories about like y'all playing music, y'all having them do art. Like you're doing some of those things, but going to a space where that's a dedicated thing, that's a powerful idea. And especially if they see that that is just as much part of the curriculum as everything else, like whole person, whole learning. It allows us, and think going back to the Bree stuff, to even further be biblical and relational and integral. And I know that especially you specials teachers, when y'all figure out ways to say what are things that are being studied and how do we integrate that into what we're learning in our specials classes, that encourages wholeness. How do specials help us cultivate a culture of grace-prompted obedience? Okay, so all worldviews deal with behavior, like, or ethics. How do we know when behavior is good or bad? How could specials maybe nurture a culture of the sort of behavior we want? Now, I always talk about grace-prompted obedience. And sometimes people see that and they overlook the idea of obedience, but obedience is still kind of, we want them to understand that obedience is good, but it's a response to grace. It's not transactional. But how could specials actually nurture a proper understanding of boundaries of what is expected of them? How could specials help in that regard?
I think of each of the different classes kind of, it's a different, like in the library, they need to learn, I like that they learn to be quiet, to be calm. In PE, you can be loud and crazy, here's how you can do that respectfully.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot, there's a lot of freeness, kind of work on your own space. It allows you to figure out how to be respectful and boundaries with a lot of freedom.
Yeah.
It's showing kids how to behave in different situations.
Yes, it is.
Meeting, acting a certain way as you do it, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, respecting people looks different in PE than it does in library. That's a great conversation to have with kids. It's a great conversation to have with them.
Which is the whole child.
The whole child. Yep. I mean, that is, and by the way, that sort of is a higher order thinking skill. You know, people love talking about in the educational circles, your Bloom's taxonomy, to be able to understand that respect, it's not just this black and white thing. It means you don't talk loud, because you could still talk loudly and still be respectful. But teaching them how to understand context, and then what does it look like to honor someone else and to honor my teacher and to honor God in different contexts. That you're calling them to something that is good for them to think through that. That is a wonderful thing for them to think through. All right, how do specials help us pursue, celebrate, and rest in God's original intent for all things? Okay, so creation, fall, redemption, creation category is not just God created stuff. But God established the original design for how he wanted all things to be. He wanted shalom. He wanted wholeness. He wanted everything to work in proper consort. I mean, think about this. Like, and I've done this kind of hypothetical exploration with y'all before. But if sin never entered the world, would we have specials?
It would all be integrated together.
It would all be integrated together. Yes. Okay, so it's kind of hard to do that. So we're trying to kind of nurture specials to kind of bring, but that's the, like, for everything to be working at the same time, you say, well, why would we not have specials? Now, if sin never entered the world, would some people be more musically gifted and other people be more like mathematically gifted? Can y'all conceive that? I mean, just because sin didn't make all of a sudden all of us like, you know, or as though if sin didn't enter the world, like all of us would be fascinating drawers. I don't think that's a result of sin. I think that gifting is just gifting. So I would think in an unfallen world, you would still have some people that are really gifted drawers and other people really, and we would help one another, but you probably wouldn't have like this, okay, we're changing gears here. We're going to go now do music. It would kind of always be hand in hand at the same time. And we wouldn't. Now, y'all do a far better job than this than like when it gets to middle school and high school, where a bell rings and you turn off your math brain entirely and you go now and do PE, turn off that, go and do whatever foreign language you're learning, and then we just like it's totally fragmented. Y'all at least have the pieces in place to work towards wholeness, but by the nature of the structure, like on some level, it's difficult to pull that off. But the specials can, how could the specials help students to understand what learning ought to be?
I'm doing thinking like character, but I feel like God, we're all different. So the students can either celebrate each other's talents or jealousy comes into play a lot of the times for stuff. So, if we're in God's original intent for all things, we live in love and harmony and kindness, and we build each other up. We don't tear each other down. But I think that can, creep in the jealousy.
Yeah. It's hard for us to properly celebrate others' giftings. It's hard. Do y'all feel like y'all have adequate space to be able to have conversations with specials teachers and specials teachers with classroom teachers to think even more about integration? Y'all feel like y'all have adequate space? No? I see more either like pause. I don't see people going, yes. Okay, so maybe that's something to say, how do, the administrators in here to say, how do you, I'm kind of like poking y'all a little bit here, but how do you even nurture a little bit more of that? Because if that's the way it was supposed to be, if the way learning should be is that you don't have like these clean breaks, how could we maybe nurture even greater integration between those? I think that'd be a fun sort of project to say, what could that look like? Once again, and I said this earlier, y'all have some advantages because y'all don't have this massive turnover. So you're not having to sort of reinvent the wheel every few years to kind of say, we already have this thing going. How do we then start making some small steps in these places to bring even more wholeness between our specials classes and our classrooms? How could specials maybe help students properly mourn or understand repentance and sin and brokenness?
Well, specifically in PE, kids do not win. The initial reaction is to blame the other person for cheating.
Yeah.
And that is and that's just sin nature at its core, right? Like that is, you cheated. That is the initial reaction.
Yep. It's front and center. Yeah. It's not just PE, it's anywhere where kids have competition. I've heard the stories of Gaga Ball. At one point, weren't we running some kind of gambling scheme or something that had to get shut down? Some kind of betting or something over. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's entrepreneurial. Okay, that's whole child. So I'm just thinking whole child. Yeah, it's creative. There's yeah. Kathy, I know you navigate some of this, and I'm putting you a little bit on the spot here with library, but you don't choose just like Pollyanna kind of books in the library, right? You allow. So how do you why do you bother having some books where it's not all?
Well, it allows them to see what other people are doing. Be compassionate, but also be one person in the world being a broken place.
Yeah. And you obviously try to put some boundaries around like age and that kind of stuff. And the rest of y'all, we are choosing books for your students. But that's, to give them that kind of exposure to see the reality of sin. And we let that. So let's say for PE class, is it possible to put things in place to, it's impossible to eliminate it, but is it possible to put things in place so that you would have no bickering ever? Could you put things in place? You could. Okay, so And listen, this is a tension, and we're gonna next time we're gonna talk about this culture of grace piece. That's gonna be, we're gonna spend all of our time on that. But rules, more rules, more rules, more rules, more rules, does that minimize some of those conflicts y'all have? It doesn't eliminate it, but doesn't minimize it. You know, if you say things like, you know, here's all these rules, you could put enough rules in place that now you have no, like, okay, if we're playing a game, if you talk, you're out. You could put really rigid rules in place and now you have no conflict. Now, but they're not enjoying the game. But aren't we trying to help them to understand that part of the experience of playing sports is to learn to navigate conflict? That's part of, like, at recess, part of your classroom. We could just, like, you sit in class, you never talk. You sit there, and we can militarize the school. And there's some schools that I've actually witnessed that where it's like, yes, they know who Athanasius is. Awesome, but there's no joy. And they walk around and everything is super rigid and they know a lot of things. But I'm like, but I kind of would like to see a little squirreliness. And squirreliness at times, yeah, it creates some problems. There's risk, yeah.
Specials are interesting. I'm thinking about my own daughter right now, who's in 5th grade. Like, specials also make kids wrestle with themselves more because it is more where you see where people's giftings are.
Mhm.
Are you a good artist? Are you a good singer? And some of those things, like when you're in a regular classroom, you might have some kids who are above or below, whatever. But they're all kind of learning this new concepts at the same time. Where in specials, you might never be a good singer, and that's just what it is. Unless you put in the 10,000 hours of work. But
Yeah.
it just might not be your natural gifting. And then to see somebody with that gifting, kids start to wrestle with themselves of like, well, what am I good at? Like, where they have to take a real look at themselves
Mhm.
and figure out who has God created me to be. You know.
Yep.
I'm who's not super athletic, and PE's a struggle right now. You know, she's just feeling so. It's like figuring out like, hey, what has God? Doesn't mean God has created you imperfectly. You know, it's just that's where you kind of, I think specials really bring out a wrestle in kids because they really see other people like, well, what, you know, there is a mournfulness a little bit too. Like, I'm just not, where they're having to figure out who am I in
Mhm.
God's image.
Yep. Yeah, there is something, and I equate this kind of like with, you know, the co-curriculars in general. And that's, you know, people call that in like middle school and high school. There is something uniquely human that's going on in those kind of places. You can access a kid's heart, like their heart, longings, affections. You can in a traditional classroom. You will do it on like a field of competition. It will happen. Or like in a performance, like where you put kids on a stage, it will access their heart. And typically, lasting change happens at the heart level, not at the head level. Like I said, it is possible. It is possible to get at their hearts in a classroom setting, but it's guaranteed you will get at their heart. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I continue to say, you know, my younger brother, his kids go to a school that doesn't have sports options because he's a missionary in Belgium. They don't, like, all their sports options are club based. You know, kind of like in England, Europe, like, so you learn to play soccer in clubs, not at your school. So my nephew is 6'4", and he can't shoot a basketball to save his life. If he was here in the States, he would have been, and it's too late now. He's a high school junior. He never joined a club. There is no access for him to go learn to play basketball unless he went and joined, you know, got involved in some club. Now you say, well, that's not that bad. But because there's no sports there, my nephew and niece don't feel a sense of loyalty to their school. It's just school. Like, it's just that's where they go to learn. There's something unique about sports and fine arts and all those kind of things that starts to kind of penetrate into kind of their hearts. You see them like, and in ways, that's almost what causes kids to most become united to their school and why they deeply love it. As much as we do all the good classroom stuff, often, and you know this too, when people talk about why they love Covenant, it's kind of the other things. It's not as though they don't care about the classroom, but the first thing that comes to them is like, we get to wrestle on the log at recess. Like that's the first, and you think about that with high schools. Like, why did you love your experience at Westminster or Whitfield or wherever else? They talk about the band or the club or the sport, like that almost, that's the thing that accesses their heart. And now that you've got their heart, you can dump in all that other stuff too. Yeah, Audrey.
Just speaking to the humanness of it too, that I think is just interesting to the time we live in. I was listening to a podcast recently that's talking about the potential for artificial intelligence to sort of rob an entire generation of students, of children of their voice, their authentic human voice.
Mhm.
I think that specials are unique in that it's not really, I suppose, like, could be manufactured through artificial intelligence, but the use of your body and your voice and your beat,
Yeah.
it is sort of the human aspect
Mhm.
that can't be
Yep.
replicated.
Sure. And they may not get things wrong because they used AI to generate it. But then they lost the risk. I mean, when some of these kids, you watch them, they get up on stage and they're terrified. Like you prepare them, Linda's prepared them, prepared them. I see how many times you've practiced them, and then all of a sudden, Grandparents' Day, and they get up there and they just like they freeze, even though we've practiced and practiced and practiced. And there's that risk that's involved there. You know, and you've put them in these, and think about like in fourth grade with the Shakespeare, like there's oof, a lot of risk, and it could go really badly. How do we deal with it when it does go badly? We take them to PE, and all of a sudden you have a fight that breaks out over rules. Like, well, that wasn't fair. Well, how do we teach our kids in the midst of that we live in a broken world? Let's not try to create a culture where we try to function as though we thought that fall never happened. It really did. And how do we then take that reality and use those experiences to help kids to learn to properly mourn and repent and to grieve, but then to take all that stuff and say, and that's why we need to run to Jesus, and that's why Jesus came. That's kind of the last question. How do specials help us actively proclaim and seek repair and restoration according to Jesus' plan? One of my favorite, and I allude to this quite often when I teach different contexts, when you get it's one of the latter scenes of the Shawshank Redemption movie with Stephen King where Andy Dufresne plays that Mozart aria. And all of these prisoners hear something, they don't even know what it is. And it once again, this is another example of like images and sounds. Like it's so much better when Morgan Freeman is saying it because his voice is awesome. But there's this beautiful music playing, and Morgan Freeman saying that for the slightest of moment, every soul in Shawshank felt free because they were exposed to beauty, that it nurtured them towards restoration. So how can specials help our kids to kind of to like repair, to like restoration when they see it, to be excited about it? How can specials help in that regard?
Well, this is a little bit of a different angle on it, but I do think specials help learn process instead of product. If you're going to proclaim and seek repair restoration, you have to focus on process and not product.
Yep.
And that's very unique for specials.
It is. Yes, that's great, Kathy. That's great. Yeah, if you're a fan of repair, a repair assumes that there's kind of like some mess along the way in that process.
I think seeing through culture, I think sports is one of the best things of like you're integrated in the culture and how you live counterculturally, and it might be the way that you can attempt to restore the world. I mean, I know that sounds, but just the people that you interact with, and that gives you that avenue to be in relationship with those people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we're seeing some of that too. I mean, I'm fascinated. My grandfather played football for the University of Michigan, and so I despise Ohio State University. Sorry, but their football team has led a revival on that campus. If it was anyone else, no one would have listened. But it was the football team, players of the football team, and it's starting to trickle throughout the entire country. It's now happened at Texas A&M and Furman and Auburn. Like, this is happening, and it started at Ohio State, and it just grieves me. But like, yeah, I mean, there is something there. I mean, our culture does function in that way. Lynn, did you ever talk to the kids about resolution with songs? Chord resolution? Okay. I think that could always be a fun conversation to have with kids where, you get all the way to the last note and don't play it and see if the kids notice that something's wrong. There is something inside us that we hunger for that resolution. And y'all know that whenever you sing songs, maybe in church or wherever else, and you're like, it didn't wrap up correctly. Like, you get there and you're like, it's one more note. I mean, maybe that's just me. Like, I like resolution. I like that if it started on a major chord, I like it to end on a major chord, not a minor chord. Like, let's bring the resolution. When you see things fixed, I mean, PE is a great place for this, where all of a sudden there's conflict, and then you figure out a way to bring kids back together, and like, this worked out, it was okay. Or let's say we're in art class, and a kid's piece he was working on or she was working on really didn't look great, and it's like, okay, they went back to the drawing board and kind of redid it and changed some things here and there, and like, yes, look at this, like, look, let's be excited about this process of learning how to take something you weren't excited about, and we tweaked it a little bit, and now you are. To be fans of restoration, to be fans of things being restored and repaired. I agree, Kathy, that's great. Thank you for mentioning the process piece. Anything else on this last question? Once again, these are great tools to nurture a sense of being upward and inward and outward as students, even us as teachers, for them to see that in us. For the language we use when we take them to specials, for them to hear from us. Once again, we're going to this because this is helping us to learn how to worship God in new ways. Not just because that's just what we do or because we have to go to specials, but because it's another opportunity for us to learn to worship God in a new way. And when we do that, we learn more about ourselves, and it teaches us how to properly love others as well. Next time, we are going to talk about our culture of grace. That is, it's in our mission, and it also causes some of those points of pressure, because we know that being a culture of grace is a great thing, but it also at times creates tension. And I think it's one of those things that I love, but at the same time, we all recognize that it's not tidy. How do we become a school that has a better opportunity to celebrate a culture of grace, recognizing it's not tidy, but then understand kind of how those boundaries give us a full picture of the way we're supposed to be? So that'll be next time. That'll be the month of October. Thanks so much for listening to our show. If you like what you heard, subscribe, leave us a comment, or share with a friend. To find out more about Renew Education, visit our website at www.renew-education.org. Watch us on our YouTube channel for various podcast episodes, YouTube shorts, and Worldview Brieflies. And you can listen to our show wherever podcast episodes are found.